Good morning and welcome to the 20th meeting of the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee in 2025. I've received apologies for this meeting from Emma Harper and David Torrance. The first item on our agenda is for the committee to agree to take items 3, 4 and 5 in private. Are members agreed? The next item on our agenda is to take evidence on the topic of children and young people's participation in sport and physical activity. And I welcome to the committee Gillian Gibson, Policy Manager, Sport and Physical Activity, COSLA; Gregor Muir, Policy and Communications Officer, Scottish Sports Association; and Ailsa Welly, Lead Manager, Sports Development, Sports Scotland. And we'll move straight to questions. And Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Gideon. Good morning to the panel. Thank you for coming in today. Can I start off really with looking at the trends over time of participation in physical activity and sport? I think it's fair to say, the evidence says on the face of it, nothing's moved. I would make a strong argument to say that physical activity and sport participation in Scotland has declined. Especially physical literacy. So how would you reflect on what's happened over the past 20, 30 years? I don't know who wants to start with that.
I'm happy to kick things off, yeah. So from a national data perspective, where we get the information to be able to understand the trends, and it kind of ties in with one of the other themes that the committee is looking at today, is there is only really two sources of data for us to be able to draw on and understand physical activity trends. So there's the Scottish Health Survey and the Scottish Household Survey. Obviously, the Scottish Household Survey asks about sport every 2 years, and the Health Survey is moving to that. The other source of data is what Sport Scotland gather through their active schools, community sport hubs and sports governing body. So the national data that at a national level we do have shows that the trends are broadly consistent, except for that changing and that stubborn gap at girls at 13 to 15. At a local level, in local authorities, you would find differing pictures because they're using different data sets. So they're using their own data collection, they're using surveys, and they're able to monitor and react on a quicker basis than annual surveys to be able to understand and identify those trends. So from information gathered from some local authorities for this session today, there are the trends do reflect that sort of national picture of broadly consistent, except for those changing things at 13 to 15 and then the next age bracket up 16 to 24. So locally and nationally the picture is broadly consistent. You will find different areas and different sort of that rural and urban island population may change, but from the data that we have available nationally and locally, it suggests that they are fairly consistent.
I think the question is in how do we reflect on the lack of progress?
I think that draws back to the data question, that I think that we don't have good enough data to understand the progress because we're only using national surveys that are gathered once every year or every couple of years. I think we need better data and intelligence to understand if the progress is as national surveys tell us. I think at a local level you'd find that every single effort in working alongside Sport Scotland and active schools and community sport hubs, or within local authorities with leisure trusts and health and social care partnerships, I think the reflection of what the data says nationally and locally from colleagues in a local authority level, I think that they would reflect that every effort is being made to improve the trends, but I absolutely take your point. It's a stubborn gap that we're struggling to move.
If anybody else has got anything to add to that?
If I could just come in there, thank you. So we know from the Scottish Health Survey data that figure of 62%, excluding the school activity of children, participate within sport within any given week, and we know then that we need to tackle that inactivity of the others who are not meeting the recommended level. When we then look at kind of programme involvement and where we're sitting in terms of the stats, there has been movement over the last few years. If we look at active schools, there's 280,000 participants
across the school year from 23-24, and that's a 6% increase from the previous year. Governing bodies as well, we know that there's an upward trend in junior membership. That's increased over the last year as well, and we also know that there's been an increase within that female participation when we look across that 10-year period. So there is small changes and movements, and that is what we're focused on doing in terms of increasing the participation levels. And what we need to do in order to do that is know what the barriers are to inactivity when children and young people are not taking part. And that's bread and butter in terms of the programmes that we're delivering on the ground through both of our Active Schools Community Sport Hub and governing body partners.
Anything to add, Gregor?
Yeah, just to quickly say, one of the stats from the sort of health survey and household survey data that's not been touched on is there is definitely an increase in sedentary behaviour. So that is a massive risk sort of across sports, that young people are not necessarily engaging in physical activity to the same level, despite the fact that the overall trend, the digits haven't moved in to a sort of substantially high degree. There is an uptick in sedentary behaviour, which is a definite risk, I think. Among those, I think, as Ilse has already said, across the governing body landscape, there's quite a lot of engagement at junior level. There's more engagement with trying to get school activity better linked to club activity, sort of long-term, and set some of those sort of long-term engagement with sport at a young age. But I do think the fact that there's a recognition from the Scottish Government around the Physical Activity for Health framework that we've not got to where we want to yet, in terms of we need to target reducing physical inactivity, that's still a pretty entrenched problem. The fact that that recognition is sort of from all parties, I think, that you want to reduce physical inactivity suggests that there's still a lot more that needs to be done, and hopefully those flat participation rates are something that can be ticked up in the next few years.
I'm really pleased you brought up the physical inactivity, because I think, as you touched on, Gillian, it's around about the data, and the data is, kids that have participated in sport at least once a week, actually is a very poor data line, quite frankly, when we match that against physical inactivity, when we match that against physical literacy, when we match that against obesity and the rise of all that. So there's obviously a trend there around a reduction in the number of times people participate. And the other thing I think that the data doesn't say is you'll find that there'll be a cohort of children who participate in several different sports in a week. So can I ask then, given that, where the barriers are and what the influences in participation, and how do we change that?
I think if I start with that one, thank you. So I think within that, you have to acknowledge and understand the barriers, and what we're finding more and more, certainly through that Active Schools lens, is having that data there for each community, so we really understand what the barrier is in that community need within that school and community environment for school and club sport. We also understand there's different barriers to schools participation in extracurricular than there is to then club participation and moving into club sport and community. And I think that's what we are focusing and targeting with our Active Schools network, our Community Sport Hub officers, is really understanding that community need to try and overcome some of these barriers that will be the need of that particular area or school environment, and it might be different, and we know it is different across the country.
If I layer on to that before I ask somebody else, you brought in the sort of school-based and non-school-based participation. It strikes me as, that if you want to participate in sport these days, kids, you have to go home and then go somewhere else, because there's a reduction, really, quite a significant reduction in extracurricular activity in schools. Do you think that's had that's an influence? We need to look at that and maybe try and reverse that trend.
I think from certainly from the Active Schools side of things, that we can look at and see the trends in terms of activity, participation, how many sessions are being put on, and that since coming out of COVID, that has increased year on year. So we know that there's more availability of sessions, and we know that they're in and around the school building. So they are extracurricular sessions after the school day, during lunchtime or before school, and that's the core element of the Active Schools role. a big part of their priorities is then connecting into that club and community space. So we were wanting our Active Schools coordinators to be actively working with our clubs and bringing them into the school environment, or bringing the kids into the club environment in that pathway, and ensuring that there's a clear pathway into both. We do know that cost barriers, travel barriers, that comes into play when we're looking at club sport participation, especially for children and young people, and that's something that we're working really hard and have got an enhanced focus on in terms of that club sport going forward this year.
I do recognise that whole sort of pathway, if you like, of getting kids involved at school and linking that into the community, and I recognise that's the way we want to do. But the reality is, it's not. You know, the figures tell us it's not happening to the level that we want it to happen. And so, how do we change that?
I think we really need to be working and investing within that club and community space to help make it easier. And we know on the ground there's lots of things that clubs are doing at that really entry level. So they are trying to make it easier in terms of pay what you can membership. So they're stripping away that cost challenge of parents not being able to afford their kids to go to sports clubs. We've also know through our Active Schools work that there's that misconception that maybe sport or sports clubs is not for you as a family or for that family, and that consistent face of doing after school sport, and then the coordinators enabling that pathway into the clubs definitely helps to break down some of that and trying to make that a clear pathway for the children from that school into their community.
I think, finally, if I could, I think my issue with that is, again, I recognise the pathway, and that's what we should be doing. But the truth of the matter is, in clubs, in many clubs, there's waiting lists, and that really, that's a trend that's fairly recent. So if we have children who want to participate and have been prevented from participating because of a waiting list, how does that play into the overall sort of picture?
I think that's the continued work with our governing body partners to ensure that we've got the right people development, and we're extending the capacity of the workforce within that club space so that we are enabling it. We know we've got challenges with facilities, and we know that the pressures around access to facilities, the cost of facilities to run more sessions to get kids in, that increases the cost then that we're charging families to then bring their child to that club. So it is going back to that kind of whole systems approach of us all working together to try and make some of these big changes that we want to see in the participation rates and the figures. And I do think it's more of a joined up approach locally as well that we'll be able to do that.
I don't know if there's any other comments you want to make before I move on.
Yeah, if I could just on that, the barriers to participation and understanding whether that's trends at a local level or a national level. It's not to underplay the work that's going on within lots of local authorities to really use different tools and techniques to understand the barriers, and then to work with children, young people and their families to remove those barriers, whether that's gender, poverty, transport, minority ethnic. It is understanding, giving young people and their families a chance to articulate through mechanisms that already exist. So Dumfries and Galloway Council, for example, have done a survey of children and young people through the Learning and Education Directorate since 2013 to understand very, very specifically participation levels and then the barriers to participation, and then put policy in place or funding in place to be able to mitigate those challenges and barriers. But the reality is that some of those things happen for a short period of time based on the funding that is available, or to fit in with national and or local priorities. But there is a significant amount of work underway to understand those barriers that may not just be about taking part in physical activity and sport. There's the wider landscape around which children and families live, and we know that there are different challenges in rural areas to urban areas and so on. So the work that happens at that national level through Sport Scotland down to local active schools, but also within local authorities to really understand their communities and their areas, and then put in place local authority and area specific mitigations for those. But a lot of the time it does come down to the resource that is available. And then we know that there is a decreasing trend in the number of volunteers that are available as well, and that is a pattern that has happened, since 2019. The reduction in volunteers, and a number of authorities that I spoke to in the last couple of weeks that have actually said that's the most significant barrier, is the number of volunteers available, and that might play into some of your, I can't speak to the club sport landscape, but that certainly plays into the local level, which I'm sure would be reflected in clubs as well.
Yeah. Just a couple of quick things to add on some of those inequalities, sort of around the poverty and the sort of cost barrier. I've had some good examples from across our membership of clubs and governing bodies who've put dedicated support in place, specifically in areas where they have challenges. So a club in Renfrew, all of their membership covers sort of SIMD 1 and 2 area. They've really grown their sort of junior membership by having targeted funding against that area and helping to transition juniors from the school environment, again, as we've already talked on, into wider club opportunities. So that's including like subsidised equipment and transport, and how they can provide more of that wraparound support that gets people active. On the sort of sex and gender question, again, it's a more interconnected issue than just how do we get more girls active, because one of the key indicators of how active girls are is how active their mother is. So if you want to provide if you want to get more girls active and involved in sport, really you want more women involved in sport and more active, because it's something like 3 times you're more likely to be involved in sport if your mother is. So it's a more holistic approach to how you might move the dial on some of that. The other big one we haven't talked about is disability. Huge amount of great work done by Scottish Disability Sport, amongst others, in the sector in Scotland, and that's an area where the amount that you invest, the amount of support required to get one individual physically active and engaged in sport is not reflective of, you know, the number ticking up 1 on a sort of engagement chart. So here's how many people we have participating. The benefit to that individual is huge. So there's possibly an issue in how we measure some of that activity, because some of the kids who are furthest away from getting involved in physical activity and sport at the moment are the ones who require the most investment and the most support to reach. So the sort of question of return on investment, you really need to do quite a lot of support for those individuals who are furthest away, and you need a genuine commitment to trying to achieve that aim, rather than necessarily saying, if you're just saying how do we increase the numbers, potentially it's the people who are already closest to sport that we accidentally target.
Thank you, Kinga.
Elena Whittam.
Thanks very much, Convener. And Gregor, you just kind of answered quite a lot of the questions that I had round about. That's all right. Round about inequalities and participation. So I'd just like to pursue that a little bit further, if I can. And I'm really interested in understanding the policies that some clubs and areas have approached round about the targeting of resourcing to actually understand how that can unlock participation. So not just the universalism that we normally have about participation and access to sport, but actually the targeting of that. So if we can think in this month, which is Gypsy Roma Traveller History Month, and we're just coming to the end of that, you know, those communities sometimes are the furthest away from activities that are on offer. So is there a way that targeting of that, those communities would help them to participate, and how could that be done?
It's a good question. It's not an area that's particularly come back from our members that I'm aware of. I certainly think in terms of that targeted engagement piece, you do need to have a long-term approach, and sort of thinking, actually, if you're going to move the dial on some of this, you need to have dedicated long-term and sustainable engagement. That probably comes back to the funding question more than anything else, and Gillian's already touched on. You might get specific programmes, but they are for a set period of time. So some of our sports have talked about the fact that there have been programmes that will be running at a UK level for 10 years. So not specifically looking at that issue, but looking at, say, women and girls participation, where they've been running for a substantial amount of time, but actually that support's coming to an end, and they're thinking, well, what support can we put in place, either from a funding perspective or from a connecting to local clubs? How do we support some of the people who were being engaged through those programmes into existing activity elsewhere? So I think there's definitely advantages to having a sort of long-term, more holistic approach. And to be honest, with some demographics and groups, it's probably more about the holistic wraparound engagement piece, and it's about getting them involved for reasons other than the outcomes that we're sort of talking about in terms of, you know, improved physical and mental health. Actually, it's fun things to do, it's meeting new people, it's engagement with communities. That piece may be an avenue that has more success potentially.
And Gillian,
I'm happy to come in on that actually, because it's the universal versus the targeted approaches is what we have been talking about a lot, certainly since I started in post, and we were just talking about it with a number of local authorities in the last couple of weeks about understanding that local data and intelligence piece that I mentioned, but who are your community and what are the barriers to specific communities? So we know that care experience young people, for example, are least likely to be active within specific communities. They're further away, they need more support, similar to Gregor mentioning children and young people with disabilities. So talking to specific communities that you know are more inactive than the general population and being really, really targeted to remove those barriers. So within a couple of local authorities, Murray and North Ayrshire, for example, doing really targeted work, and in Stirling with care experienced young people to make sure that they have free memberships, and that is along with their, you know, free travel for their under 22s, that when they get to a venue that it is free to access membership. In Stirling that's at the peak, and in North Ayrshire they have specific programmes around care experienced young people. In Murray they've got a sports kit for all programme in a number of communities where people can donate their kit that they've grown out of or that somebody else can use. So it's kind of been very, very intentional as opposed to the broad brush. Alongside the universal, to get as many people active as possible, it's understanding your communities, who's inactive in those, and how can be really intentional and invest in those programmes, as Gregor said, for the long term. And funding is a challenge within that, but that wraps around into wider, whether that's council priorities or national priorities, that we are very intentional, and there's lots and lots of examples of using that local data and information to be really intentional to bring those furthest from activity, and perhaps that's furthest from things like organised activity, to just encourage things like active travel, generally being outdoors a little bit more often, and instead of bringing people who are least active into the organised activity, it's understanding what would help make them more active, and that sort of community engagement and participation piece about it, that targeted interventions alongside that universal support.
And do you feel as if in policies it's reflected the fact that inequalities are intersectional? So in all of this, you know, we're making mention of specific areas and demographics.
Absolutely.
Do we feel as if the policies are reflecting the intersectional nature in general of inequalities, and that can be multiplied for an individual, which then will make them the furthest away from engaging in what's on offer?
I think yes and no. I think there are some examples where we look at inequalities in the round, but I think all too often it's either where the funding sits or where that local priority is, we end up in some cases targeting a specific group within a population. We have a new, COSLA has a new sport and physical activity special interest group, a cross-party group of elected members, and we have been talking from the very outset about intersectionality of inequality, and I will make no apologies for going back to the data piece, that even the data that we do have doesn't allow us to intersect any of that data. So you're kind of making assumptions about females with a disability that live in SIMD Area 1, instead of the data being in front of us to be able to intersect all of those and then make the policy decisions for that intersectional based data. So you'll find that at a local level using local systems and data and intelligence, but I'm not sure it's a universal approach to targeting using taking that inequality, that intersectional inequality lens. I think that's the intention, but there are barriers to that being probably consistently applied.
Okay, and do you think that those barriers, I mean, Ailsa, I know that you spoke about the active schools coordinators and how they would actually work with young people in the school setting to help them to find a path into community-based activities and sport. Do you think that those active school coordinators have enough resource and time to actually really look across the intersectional issues that might be in front of a young person that's actually putting barriers in their way to actually respond to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a huge ask. If we look at our coordinators, it's a network of over 400 coordinators and managers that we have across the 32 local authorities, and a lot of them will have multiple primary schools and a secondary school setting that they are looking at, and we are putting a big ask on them to have a look at every school community and get to know every child and find out why, you know, especially looking at those children, young people who may be inactive. So we know that that's a big ask, but through some upskilling that we're doing with the coordinators, we are trying to get under the skin of that and really understand what intersectionality means and what that effect might have on then the multiple barriers that children and young people may face dependent on situation. Recently we funded the inclusion projects, which was short-term investment into learning projects to build on active schools and community sport hubs, to put a bit of additionality in to really find out what is working, what inclusion approach principles can be learned from these projects that we've put in. And that investment unfortunately will end in coming into the end of March in 2026, but we can take that learning and share that across the network to others, which I think it's definitely not enough. There's definitely more that we can do, but it's a step in the right direction in terms of that understanding.
And I'm wondering if there's a role, I mean, Gregor, you spoke about if you increase the participation rates of women in activities and sports, you might see that trickle down into in terms of their girls being in sport participation. I wonder, should there be targeted interventions in terms of some of the activities on offer in local areas that actually would look to bring whole families in to participate in an activity together? And is that something that we should really be looking at improving? I know locally that's something that I used to do with my kids, and it was something that was an inexpensive night, and there was a huge amount of different activities that was on offer for us as a family, and we could participate in that. Is that something we should be looking at doing?
I think the short answer is yes, absolutely. I think getting families involved, getting parents involved, it's a key indicator for how active their children are. It's also, I know we're talking to other themes later on, but it's a pathway to getting more people involved in volunteering. They come along to events, they engage with other people, they really support what activity is being delivered. So as well as being active, they sort of get engaged in the community around about it. So yeah, family focused. I think on the disability point as well, getting support to allow carers to be involved, so free access to events and making sure that the setup round about those is that some people need additional support, and that should be considered when you're doing those events. So yeah, absolutely making sure that you've got activities that are accessible to to families, but to other groups as well, where you might think actually there's some additional support that we can offer. I mean, I said that resource is often the big challenge there, because covering all bases for how much support you could offer to people, I think is a big challenge. But yeah, absolutely. I think getting families involved and setting sort of physical activity standards from early in life is a huge opportunity in terms of making sure that there's lifelong participation there.
Thanks. And Gillian, do you want to come in?
Do you know, I was talking to a colleague actually in Sport Ireland about the number of time and the number of hours that a child spends in school, and it's 20 to 30% of their year that a child spends in school. So lots of phenomenal work going on in school and with active schools. But what we really need to focus on is that family and that wider family. And I think there are really phenomenal opportunities through the whole family support programme that I know government are really invested in at the moment, and actually prioritising the importance of physical activity and sport around that whole family well-being and that whole family approach to life. We all know, I'm sure everybody around the table is very well aware of the benefits of participating, the multiple benefits of participating in physical activity and sport, and that is seen as a thing that is absolutely important to do individually and as a family, and that we provide opportunities and that wraparound support for families to participate. But those opportunities, it's a cultural thing that we need to be able to strive towards in Scotland, that physical activity and sport is part of life, as opposed to lots and lots of targeted little things that we do based on the funding. So I think there are, along with other national priorities with child poverty, with whole family support, I think there are real opportunities for us to make sure that physical activity and sport opportunities are embedded in other work that is going on, instead of let's do sport and physical activity over here. Let's actually transfer sport and physical activity into wider priorities, whether that's through health and social care partnerships or whatever that might be at a local level. I think that's where we should strive to be, as it's part of life, as opposed to a thing we do after school or a thing we do on our own in the gym as an evening and the kids are at home. So how do we look more holistically at those opportunities?
And I guess what you're describing there to me sounds like that being early intervention and prevention work in action.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Sandesh Gohani, we're not able to see you in the room, so I wonder if you could check your camera, please. Thank you. Before I move on to my colleague, you've mentioned a couple of times, Gillian, about data and data collection and the lack of robust data around some of these issues. So what's COSLA doing to try and encourage local authorities to collect data on participation in sport?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, we've got a new sport and physical activity special interest group chaired by our community wellbeing spokesperson and our health and social care spokesperson, and there are 15 elected members. That special interest group was established in October last year, and it has 5 priority themes, and one of those is data improvement, recognising that from a local government perspective, our national data collection is around the local government benchmarking framework, and there are 4 measures in the LGBF that are related to leisure, and there is a widespread recognition that they need to be improved. So we're working with the Local Government Benchmarking Framework Programme Board and a number of local authorities and leisure trusts to understand what indicators we could add to the LGBF to do 2 things: represent local government's role in the leisure sector, so leisure as it broadly sport, physical activity, but it's termed leisure in the LGBF. So how do we represent our role in that sector better, and then how do we have better indicators that help us move towards improvement at that local government perspective? So we've started to explore that work. We've got a short life working group looking at how we improve the LGBF. Separate to that is some work around data innovation and data creativity with partners. So working with Sport Scotland, working with Community Leisure UK, and learning from Sport England, Sport Ireland in particular, and other international countries on how and what mechanisms they use to collect information. So whether that's very, very specific surveys, as they do in England through moving communities and active life surveys, they do similar in Sport Ireland, is really investing in the collection of better data and then being able to have a platform in which we can upload that data, for want of a better phrase, and being able to intersect all of that information, as others have mentioned today. So we're exploring those kind of ideas with partners, because we know that local government doesn't deliver all of those services in isolation, and that's the same for Leisure Trust and Sport Scotland. So we're really exploring and learning from other countries about how we can do better, so that we can do some of the things that other committee members have mentioned today about that, understanding the barriers and exploring how we break those down effectively. So lots of work. Data, for me, has been the fundamental part of the first few months of this post, is how do we move the inactive to active if we don't know who the inactive are and we don't know where they are. So really being very intentional about exploring that data.
Okay, thank you very much. Joe Fitzpatrick.
Thanks very much, Convener. Gregor, I think you earlier on talked about the Physical Activity for Health framework, so keen to explore a bit about that. Obviously, it was published in October last year, so relatively new. Good to hear how the 3 organisations are responding to that, trying to make sure it's not just a document on the shelf, but it's actually changing the way organisations work. So, Gregor, you mentioned it earlier, so do you want to go first?
Yep, I think there's lots to be very positive about with the framework. Certainly for our part, there's a lot of positive ambition set within even the context within that, because there's a huge recognition of the importance of partnership between national, local government, with wider partners, stakeholders across sport. It's very broad ranging in terms of the areas that it touches on, and even the sort of contextualisation. There's a commitment from government in there, with cabinet secretaries and the First Minister providing the forward to that there's a recognition that actually this is across directorates, it's across policy areas. Sport is not an addendum to everything else that we're doing. Actually, it's pretty fundamental across a whole range of areas that the government invests in. So in terms of that sort of context piece, there's a lot to be very positive about it. The extent to which it's fully filtered down at this stage through to governing bodies in terms of what practice that they're implementing, I'm not sure to what extent that's happened yet. I think you will see it come into more strategic plans and corporate plans as they get renewed, and that actually this is a very helpful focus document, and there's some really positive case studies in there in terms of how some of that partnership work can be introduced, and that sort of working partnership principle is something that came through from some of our members in support of this session, sort of talking about where people have seen sort of increases in numbers where they've had effective engagement between the governing body, but also between the local authority, but also private sector organisations who support their sport. So there's a recognition within the framework that sort of active places and workforces, there's a few different strands in there that touch on lots of different areas of all of our work. I think one significant issue is that all of the ambitions within that framework need to be effectively resourced to make them happen. At the moment, the Scottish Government budget against sport is relatively flat in sort of real terms. Since in this new Parliament it's a real terms decrease, and in the environment to sort of achieve some of the ambitions that are being talked about in the framework, really that should be a significant increase if you want to actually get some of that stuff put into practice. So that is one thing I would say. I think the ambition is sound, and sort of across a lot of different areas. There's a good recognition of where sport and physical activity fits into that, but the resource behind some of those ambitions isn't there yet.
I suppose one of the things from the document is about that cross-cutting nature which you mentioned. Do you think that the framework gives you extra the ability to be more forceful in making the case if your policy isn't taking activity into account? Do you feel like you can refer back to it, or is there more we need to do? By the way, it was helpful that you made the point that we're not there yet. And that's good to know, because if you thought it was, we would all think there was a problem because we know we're not there yet. So that was good to hear that directly from yourself.
Yeah, no, I do think that there's definitely utility in it. We refer to it within our advocacy work. I do think particularly with regard to engagement with other parts of the sector who do not typically work or consider sport, physical activity within their remit. So it's very useful to be able to say, well, actually, your Cabinet Secretary said this is why sport and physical activity is important to our ambitions. That is a very helpful tool for us to have in our armoury, whether it has the weight required. I don't know if I can answer that one.
Okay, thanks. Can I come to you? I'm going to come to you last for a really good reason, Julian. Ailsa, obviously you were obviously involved in developing the framework, so it'd be good to hear your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. From a Sport Scotland point of view, so within the work that we are doing, we're working alongside Public Health Scotland currently, and we're in discussion with 20 local authorities around the system-based approach and embedding the physical activity for health strategy. 13 of them are actively adopting the systems-based approach using the physical activity for health framework currently. As you will have seen, Glasgow have been the first to launch their strategy, demonstrating that alignment to the national framework that we've got. Our role then, from a Sport Scotland point of view, is leading the sporting system contribution to that framework and that systems-based approach, and demonstrating that contribution that we are showing how to help people participate, progress and achieve within sport. So the evidence shows that clear contribution of sport, and I think it's really great to have that framework at the heart of that.
Do you think the framework is helping bridge the gap from the folk who we had earlier are entirely physically inactive to getting a bit of activity and then moving folk into organised sport as well, which is, I guess, the thing we have to do if we're going to get our elite athletes? You know, we don't know who the elite athletes are going to be. They could be anywhere, and we know for sure that socio-economic factors influence who gets to participate, but they don't determine who's got the potential. So is there...
Absolutely, and I think the sporting system that's been in place with ourselves and our partners and has been embedded over the last number of years is really helpful positioning in terms of that whole pathway from school and education all the way through to our performance, but really showcasing that there's a place for sport for everyone, and that Sport for Life ethos that we've got. The emphasis on that preventative health agenda is really important, and that's an important opportunity for ourselves as well to switch on the role that physical activity and sport can play.
Yep, great, thank you. Gillian, the reason I was wanting to come to you last is because I think the framework's a really good document, but I think local government is absolutely key to being able to make it happen in the real world. And so it's really good to hear about the special interest group. I know that there are some folk in local government who are, I'm going to choose my words carefully, almost as passionate as Brian Whittle is in this area.
Absolutely.
And so it's really good that you're pulling that resource together.
Yep.
And so it'd be good to hear how that's working and making sure that the policies that government have and the ambition that government has is reflected in the kind of work that local government's doing. Absolutely on the ground and critical, I think.
Yeah, I think if I can explore the national and the local perspective of the framework, because what the framework is phenomenal is takes all of that incredible systems-based work that Public Health Scotland did, international evidence, and turned it into a Scottish context, and put front and centre the importance of physical activity, of which sport is a fundamental and key part of that. But that systems-based approach to reach that World Health Organization target that we have adopted of a reduction in physical inactivity by 15% to 2030. And this framework puts in the evidence base to make sure with those 8 investment areas that we are able to be a more active nation. Local government absolutely is a key part of that. And as Ailsa's mentioned, we've got 13 authorities at the moment directly working with Public Health Scotland and Sport Scotland to revise local strategies in line with the framework. At a national level, we've got the National Leadership Group for Physical Activity and Sport, chaired by the Minister, Marie Todd, and sitting alongside that is the National Development Group for Physical Activity and Sport. And this is where the framework started. It's a cross-organisation. So while I absolutely agree that Sport Scotland are absolutely bought into sport and recreation for all, I think nationally and across Cabinet and ministers, I think we have more work to do to embed the other 7 investment areas into other organisations' work and priorities. So active places and spaces around planning, education and Education Scotland and the active places of learning, along with higher and further and higher education establishments, and the same with Transport Scotland. I think there is more that we can do to make sure that at a national level, those bodies with responsibility for those elements of the framework are as bought in and as accountable as Sport Scotland are to their part of the framework. They are obviously working very fundamentally on sport and recreation for all, but there are 6 other systems that they are also trying to support and enable at a local level through that systems work. And I say that because I think there is a journey for us to go on, and it has only been 9 months or so since it was launched. So it's a long-term systems-based approach. We have more work that we can do, and we have the national forums to be able to do that through the leadership group and the development group, and through COSLA and our special interest group. And we are bringing those 2 groups together at the end of the year. The leadership group with the Minister and Transport Scotland, Sport Scotland, Nature Scotland, Public Health Scotland and so on, with COSLA Sport and Physical Activity group, to bring those 2 together at the beginning of December to make sure that we are really nationally focused on what value those national organisations can add so that it supports the local level of work. But as Fraser mentioned, one of the fundamental challenges is the framework came with no money. So there was, excuse me, I've got a frog in my throat. There was the commitment in the 21-22 programme for government to double the sport budget, or sport and active living budget, by the end of this Parliament, and that commitment has not been met. It wasn't in the recent programme for government. So we've got the fundamentally phenomenal intentions of a framework. It's very clear what we're trying to achieve with that physical inactivity target. There is more that we can do in the coming months and years, and we absolutely are committed at local government, and I know the leadership group and development group can do that and are committed to that. But we do need to look at the investment around how are we going to tackle some of the things that your colleagues have mentioned without a conversation about the investment to be able to do those things on a long-term and sustained basis.
That's great. Thanks. It was really good that you kind of covered the areas I was going to go on to next in terms of transport and education. I guess the one area you didn't raise, and it's probably worth just throwing it in there, is health and directly, NHS being proactive, because it probably, as part of the public service, NHS has got the most to gain by having a more active nation. Keen to go into more transport type stuff, but I feel I would be treading on an area that Mr Harvey wants to tread on, so I will leave that for him for later. So, thanks very much.
Carol Morgan.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to touch on facilities and the availability of facilities to communities. It's certainly something that's raised with us very frequently. The sort of decline in stock, the availability, particularly in rural areas, and the funding to try and upgrade facilities so that people can access facilities that we would all enjoy to use. So I wonder whether anyone might be able to give us a little bit of a picture of how they feel facilities out there are for people, and whether any funding that's become available has been useful that we might be able to think about in the context of other areas.
First, thank you.
Thanks.
So we know that we're facing a particular challenge with the sports facilities estate. Well-known staffing, energy, construction costs are all rising, especially since the pandemic, and we know that the local and national government capital budgets are under severe pressure with regards to that. At Sport Scotland, we're asked to undertake the review of the sports facilities estate, and we're aware that that's a significant undertaking in terms of carrying out that estate's review. The review will be published later on this year and will establish a high-level summary of the changes from the previous national audit of the sports facilities estate, and looking at the age, condition and location of the facilities included within the previous audit compared with where we are now, and then scope out a more detailed next phase in terms of taking into consideration things like school estate and what needs upgraded, etc.
Can I ask, will that look at who is going to be responsible for that estate? Because I think over the last years there has been, because of financial pressures, the sort of more community ownership, which we know is really heavy on a lot of communities because the costs are so high.
So we know that local authority is responsible for that community sports and leisure facilities currently, and there is examples out there where we've got community asset transfer, etc. Happening. But I don't think the focus of the review will cover that one yet.
We'll find out from that, no bother. That's helpful to know. And in terms of any capital investment that's underway at the moment, has that happened in recent years for sort of community assets? Does anybody know of? Yeah,
I can come in. So on your overall theme about access to facilities, just to reassure committee, that is one of our key themes of the Sport and Physical Activity Special Interest Group, is access to facilities and opportunities. We're working really closely with Sport Scotland on that estates review to make sure that we have a high level of returns from all 32 authorities to understand what that picture looks like, and then to look at what the investment is required to make sure that we have a sporting estate and an estate for physical activity that meets our net zero targets, that is sustainable for the future, that and that it exists, I suppose, to be able to reach those physical inactivity goals. In terms of capital investment, I know Sport Scotland have a specific facilities fund. There is significant investment in local authorities. You'll find some authorities building new facilities, like in Clackmannanshire, looking at a wellbeing hub where it's a holistic approach to physical activity, sport and mental health and wellbeing all taking place in that wraparound area. There's significant investment, as you'll all know, in schools and the school estate, and making sure that the new school builds with that sporting facility are open and accessible to communities. So, like you, through my members, elected members and local authorities and other organisations, there's a lot of people that mention access to facilities as a challenge. And I'm going to sound like a broken record, but the data to support that, we don't have, COSLA doesn't have that. So what we hear from perhaps Gregor and his members, and quite rightly, and the same with other governing bodies, is we can't access the school estate in this community. These facilities are closed, and we hear a lot of that anecdotally, which is why we added access to facilities as one of our key themes, and why we're so keen to work alongside Sport Scotland, is to get that data and evidence about what is available, what is open, what is accessible from the school estate to the general estate for sport, and understand that data in a holistic picture, because there's a lot of anecdotal, and I can't speak to all of the reasons why facilities might not be accessible. We know a lot of that is cost, availability of staff, school prioritising the lets until 6 o'clock at night. There are lots of different reasons, but until we understand the picture at a national level to address that, with whether that is capital investment or not, I suspect there will be lots of accessing facilities that won't be down to capital investment. It will be looking at the wider picture around staff availability and other priorities in the area. So we are keenly aware that it's an issue, but keen to work with partners who are taking that work underway, who have that work underway. We have the Minister in Sport Scotland actually coming along to the Special Interest Group in August to have an update on that estates review, amongst other things, to be able to look at how do we work together to improve access to facilities, but also what is needed to make that estate thrive. But there has been no specific capital investment coming through directly to government. There will be some government support in some projects in some local areas, as opposed to a universal capital investment programme for sport.
Okay, no bother. Thank you. Do you want to come in, Gregor?
Yeah, just to add, obviously, facility access is something that comes up a lot across our membership. So whether that's accessibility in terms of opening hours, I know a lot of leisure trusts have had to either reduce hours or close on certain days due to financial pressures. That's pretty not uncommon, I should say. I do think that there will be a lot of information that comes out of the Estates Review that will help inform some of this work. The Scottish Government did commit to a review of access to the school estate in the 23-24 programme for government. That, I believe, has been subsumed within that wider review, so the school estate is sort of captured within that, and I do think that's important because schools really can act as community hubs for a lot of this activity, so not just physical activity and sports, but how that connects to other local ambitions. I do think just in terms of the time that the committee has, I do think that facilities is going to be a major issue, and the investment that will be required to make sure that our sporting estate is fit for purpose for the future. Going into the next Parliament, I do think that that should be a priority issue in terms of the handover to the next Health and Sport Committee of actually facilities. Without accessible and affordable facilities, none of the activity that we're talking about is possible. So it's absolutely a fundamental issue and should be treated as such. And yeah, we look forward to the review being published later this year to see what's in there that we can help collaboratively work on that.
I've got two more, I promise. Just quickly, the one thing that strikes me as raised with me repeatedly is some of the activities that are quite expensive to run and they end up being in local government, which is around swimming pools and access to swimming pools. I don't need an answer, I don't think. I think we just need to be aware that many people want to encourage their children to learn to swim, but when we talk to local authorities, we know it's an extremely expensive, it doesn't make any profit, so it's down to use. So it's an important thing for us to consider. But the other thing that was raised with is that in terms of cost, it seems that younger people, juvenile costs to participate in sports seem to be going up disproportionately to adults. And I wondered if that was something you were familiar with, or if you had any sort of thoughts on why that might be.
I think that is something that we do recognise in terms of that barrier and pricing for local facilities. As we'd mentioned, the sport facilities is an ageing estate, and with that there is pressures then on local authorities and commercial bodies that are running these facilities, and that's got the knock-on then to participants. So definitely something that we're aware of, and I think again something that we need to overcome by working together to ensure that we can keep the prices as low as they can. And if I could just touch on the Sports Facilities Fund, which is the fund that supports the capital projects from ourselves, so that's Scottish Government and National Lottery funding. And since 2007, we've invested over 211 million into sports clubs, community groups, local authorities, governing bodies and other organisations to upgrade some of the sporting facilities, just to note that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I don't have specific information on the cost to hand, but Sport Scotland do a review every year about the cost of facilities. I've got some of the figures in front right now, but we can provide a committee with that afterwards. It's something that Sport Scotland gather, and I've got in front of me by local authority the cost of a swim, the cost of a badminton court, and that is a list from alphabetically by local authorities. I'm happy to provide that to the committee after today.
Yeah, that'd be helpful. Thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Got a lot of interest in this particular subject, so if we could perhaps have brief supplementaries and brief responses, that would be helpful. Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Convener. I think the frustration for me here when we're talking about we have significant restrictions on the ability to invest, but we actually don't know. We don't have an audit of facilities, whether that be in community or school facilities. We don't have an audit of them, and therefore we don't know what spare capacity is available in the actual structures that we currently have. So if we keep talking about investing in new facilities, and yet we can't actually gather the data together to say, where the spare capacity might be. Surely that's where we should start.
And that work is happening through the estates review that Sport Scotland are doing at the moment, that they will report on later on in the year, I believe, towards the end of August. And that is exactly part of that audit is what facilities do we have, when are they open, when are they closed, how accessible they are. So that overall audit, I think if we go individually to local authorities, they would understand their own sporting estate, but at a national level, that picture has not been updated for some time, and that's we are really invested. I've spoken to Solace in recent months and through the Sport and Physical Activity Special Interest Group to make sure that there are as close to returns from 32 local authorities, and that's split between what the core facts of the estate are. So what is the estate, what does it look like, and the school estate and access to that school estate. And because that's a key and fundamental bit of the future is there will always be investment in schools, and community access to schools is a huge part of where local authorities are looking at their sporting estate and being able to, whether that is closing facilities because that's the right thing to do, because actually there are more people using a new school that's been built in a community and there are better transport links. All of that happens at a local level when it comes to auditing what's there, what is needed to serve the community and what's affordable. And the reality is we're in a really, as you know, a challenging fiscal environment where everything we have right now is perhaps not affordable. And that could just be down to energy costs and the lack of staff. So the audit that Sport Scotland are doing at the moment will be a key piece of information for us all to understand what the sporting estate is and what we perhaps need. So the conversation doesn't need to be all about what we build. We have to maximise what we have, and that kind of wraps around some of those other goals that we have around the fiscal environment, our net zero challenges. Swimming pools are extremely energy inefficient, and we have to look at it in a holistic sense. It's not just about what we build, it's about what we have and what we need.
Thank you.
Paul Sweeney.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Just wanted to follow up on the audit, because I think getting this right is critical for our understanding of the picture. Will it be a time series? It won't just be a snapshot in time. It will also look at what was happening on the eve of the lockdown, so we can understand the delta in capacity from pre-lockdown period, because I know certainly in Glasgow there's been a significant cliff edge, so just speaking from personal experience. but also considering what's happened in terms of ownership, because I know a lot of assets that were previously council owned, for example, have now transitioned into third-party operation. Will these factors be included in this audit, or can they be? Because I think that would be really valuable data.
Yes, I don't have all of that detail with me today, but certainly something we can follow up and provide more in a written response, if that's okay. We know that the previous audit highlighted costs of in excess of 110 million. That was back in 2006 in terms of that investment to upgrade and maintain the sports facilities that we've got over that long period of time. So that was looking ahead for a 25-year period. But certainly can provide that further information for you on this one.
It's helpful. Thank you.
Just a quick one again on the subject of access to facilities. And we know that access to the school estate, as we've been hearing, is one of the untapped resources that we have. But I'm wondering just how the school contracts in terms of the legacy PFI issues have become such a barrier to actually doing that. Because I know locally when we've tried to do that previously, to actually have the facilities management company come in to open up the schools, made it just cost prohibitive completely for that to happen. Is that still an issue? Do we know that yet?
Anecdotally, without the evidence right in front of me, I can say that's still a challenge locally, is those contracts and the costs to be able to open up. I think if you asked almost every local authority that had similar contracts, that they would say that would be a barrier, and that's why the school gates are closed. It's cost inefficient to be able to open them, because it's actually not them that's opening them, it's Mighty or whoever else is managing the school. Some of those contracts start to come to an end next year. I think Falkirk is the first council where these types of contracts start to end. And we've had some informal conversations with officers in Falkirk about what that looks like. They will be the first authority that comes out of those contracts, and what those facilities and access to them, to that school estate, looks like in the next year, 5, 10, 15 years when we've got that facility left. But the absolutely is still a challenge. To what extent, I don't know. I'm happy to explore that a little bit further if that's something the committee want us to do. I can explore that through our network and our special interest group to understand that a little bit better. As with community asset transfers, if that's not included in the estates review, to get a better, more holistic approach to those assets that local government own and manage.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I was going to come on to funding, which I think leads on fairly neatly, but also to follow up on Joe Fitzpatrick's questions as he teed me up for earlier on the questions he was raising. I'll do the funding stuff first because I think it leads on a little more smoothly. I mean, there's been clearly discussion there about the capital available for facilities and the needs for upgrades, and also the impacts on pricing, but more generally in relation to funding of ongoing services that are relevant here. Can you give us an overview of the current state of affairs in relation to funding beyond the capital issues that have just been discussed, and in particular to what extent funding itself is creating barriers to participation?
One off, if you, or I'll try my best. Obviously, Sport Scotland are the beneficiaries of a large portion of the money that comes from Active Scotland into the sporting landscape, whether that's revenue and capital. There isn't any ring-fence funding, and COSLA doesn't advocate for ring-fence funding, but there isn't any direct funding that comes out of the budget into increasing opportunities for physical activity and sport. That is down to local discretion and local decision making, which is where you find some of the challenges that we've mentioned today. I think in terms of funding, I've mentioned it already, but it would be remiss of me as a COSLA officer not to mention that unfilled commitment of doubling the sport and active living budget within this Parliament, which would have seen a significant investment, whether that was revenue or capital, to be able to meet some of our ambitions that are within the framework, or the Active Scotland Outcomes framework as it was before the framework was published. So there will be significant third sector, national lottery and funding that's there. But those are bid funds, and they are, as you know, short-term investments to target and tackle something that's happening locally. So funding absolutely remains a challenge, whether that's revenue funding or, as you've heard already, that capital investment.
The briefing that we've been given suggests that local government investment in culture, sport and leisure across the whole country is down by at least 20% since 2010-11. Is that accurate? Would local government recognise that figure? Yeah,
so the ECOS report, is that what you're referring to, that was published with Community Leisure Queue and Sport Scotland? I would absolutely... I can't speak for every local authority. I think broad brush, some of them would see that as an absolute reality. That is one of the fundamental challenges about this part of the sector in local government is it's a discretionary service. So as pressure increases on statutory services, so health and social care and education, and that's where the money has to go, it squeezes those discretionary services. I would love if we could, as a society, challenge the fact that culture and leisure are discretionary and things that we absolutely all as a right should have access to improve our lives. And you know, that well-rounded approach to life. But that is the reality of the sort of all the coalface with increasing pressure on statutory services. And yeah, there was an increase in the local government budget settlement, but it actually took us back up to a real terms, balancing out those real terms cuts over previous years. So those squeezes will continue as we see pressure on whether it's ring-fenced government priorities, teacher numbers or whatever else that might be, puts a squeeze on some of the other discretionary services that I wish I wasn't describing them as a discretionary service, but that is the local reality.
I don't want for a moment to underplay the importance of that funding question, but we talked right at the beginning, and I think there was a broad sort of picture painted about levels of participation not having risen but being fairly static over the long term. So if we're being effective in the way that we use funding and it's gone down by 20%, what is it that explains the discrepancy there? You know, if the funding is effective at increasing participation and the funding has gone down and participation hasn't, is there a mismatch there? Is there a problem with the way the funding was previously used, so that if we can restore that level of funding, there's a more effective way to get increased participation from it?
I think, but whether this is a cop-out answer, but I'm going to say yes and no, because it's true to say that all opportunities for physical activity and sport don't happen in a facility. Yeah. There are more people walking now than ever. There will be more people that enjoyed different activities as a result of lockdown, Couch to 5K and Park Run and other things that have enabled people to be active in different ways. So I don't think it's as one-sided as less resource, we've maintained the physical activity levels, we don't need that resource that we had before. I think it's a holistic view of what do we need to do to ensure that the population who is active have places to remain active and understand those challenges of bringing the inactive into activity. I think it plays into that, again, that Sports Scotland's Estates Review and that data piece. We really do need to understand the landscape a little bit better, and how people are active now compared to 10 years ago is different. Yeah. We're in a completely different life than we were pre-COVID, and that we need to be able to have the resource, the up-to-date data that's not 2 years old, to be able to make decisions based on what people need that are in front of us, and that'll be organised sport and activity through clubs, that'll be informal through leisure centres and the like, or it'll be people just with that sort of public messaging and understanding that you need to be more active more often, and finding the place for you to be able to do that suits you, I think, is the balance of, we've not seen that cliff edge drop in participation, but equally imagine what we would see if it wasn't a discretionary service and it was resourced in the way we would want to see, where those physical activity levels might go.
Yeah. And unless there's a an unexpected change. The current picture for local government does not look rosy in terms of overall funding for the future.
Yeah.
Costs are continuing to be a bigger burden than would have been the case in previous years. Are we yet at a point where those who make decisions about how those kind of pressures get managed are properly taking into account the preventative role of sport and physical activity in preventing further, not only human but financial costs into the future? Because we are still seeing decisions made that are going to exacerbate those long-term costs.
Absolutely.
For short-term expediency.
I feel like you've described my life's work at the moment, is absolutely ensuring that any decision maker, and whatever title you have, understands the value and the role and contribution of physical activity in sport, not just in a health and well-being context, but the wider policy landscape. So the description of it being a discretionary service, our statutory services would be poorer. Maybe it's not financially poorer, but those people that need those services, their lives would be poorer if they didn't have access to these things that are described as discretionary services. We absolutely have a way to go to take sport and physical activity landscape out of just talking about sport for sport or physical activity for physical activity. There is multiple contribution and benefits to the wider policy and legislative landscape, and I think that's certainly the way I talk about sport is how will it help us with our ambitions with net zero? How are we going to? It should be included in public sector reform, poverty and child poverty. All of those things we need physical activity and sport to be around that landscape. But in the early intervention and prevention side of things. It's a figure I wrote down really early this morning, actually, and I think we need to have in our mind is the cost of physical activity to the NHS in Scotland is estimated to be £77 million annually. So it's not
of physical inactivity.
Physical inactivity, the cost to the NHS in Scotland is £77 million a year. So we really need a wider conversation on on prevention and early intervention. The earlier that people are active and the longer that they are active for, the better their life will be, the less pressure on different services we will see. So that holistic conversation about early intervention and prevention, and the really important bit is a conversation we have to have across sectors, across lines of responsibility. It's a really, really important one because the imperative is there to do it, and the framework outlines that 3,000 people a year die in Scotland every year from physical inactivity. So if we don't get it right, we're doing a disservice. But there's to the people of Scotland. But we have to look at that away from local government services and actually across the whole of the public sector.
Last question on funding, and this might be a point to bring in our other witnesses. Are there other solutions out there that aren't being adequately explored properly, or perhaps other solutions that are, in some cases, having positive opportunities, whether that's partnership models, whether it's provision through social enterprise or not-for-profit basis, whether that's community ownership has been talked about and it's got pros and cons. Are there other solutions out there that can help to increase the provision or support the provision and participation in the context of those local government finance pressures?
Yeah, I mean, I think within the sporting sector, clubs especially have always been very unique in this space in terms of how they can afford to run their club, how they can gain members and membership. And there's definitely a lot over the years that we've seen. Community sport hubs are definitely in a position to be within that community area, and really, again, going back to that community need, and they're partnering with a lot of third sector organisations, charitable organisations, to really try and deliver things differently. But I think fundamentally greater public investment is needed within that sporting system at both local and national level if we really want to make fundamental changes and to really see the growth of participation. And again, it's been touched on, but the previous commitment to doubling the sport and active living budget, we would certainly want to see progress made on that, even if that extends into the future and next parliamentary term as well.
Anything to add?
Yeah, just a A couple of quick ones, just to make it a full house. Also very much support the doubling of the sport and active living budget. So we've all said it. Absolutely, that commitment needs to be followed through on. I do think that there's an issue with the way budgets are set in terms of annual cycles. It doesn't leave a lot of space for innovation and forward planning. There are inefficiencies to the way that is structured, and that people are having to do, right, okay, we're into the cycle again, we've just got to try and get a balanced budget out and then get into the next year. And that, obviously, as you say, it means people make short-term decisions. The way that budgets are set is an issue. I know Scottish Government have been looking to do more multi-year funding agreements with wider voluntary sector organisations. I think that's absolutely a model that should be explored for sporting organisations. It just gives people more capacity and more reassurance in terms of workforce development and longer-term planning that potentially lets you put some more efficiencies in there and also invest to decrease your overheads over time. I think that's something that a lot of people simply, there is not the money, the capital available to do innovation projects or sort of looking at it. It's just not the case. So at the moment, that would be a big opportunity. I think that actually there could be reduction in costs and different ways of working, but you need to invest to make those opportunities happen.
No, I think that's a fair point. If I could just crowbar around one supplementary to Joe Fitzpatrick's questions about the framework, and this does come back to COSLA in particular. I don't expect you as a representative of COSLA to issue some kind of scathing assessment of where local government is at on this. But would you agree that if you and colleagues in individual councils who are focused on this particular topic are doing everything they can, and yet across those other issues in the framework, like active travel, like economic development, if people making decisions about, planning decisions about where development goes, end up generating more traffic between where young people live and where they want to get to for all sorts of different purposes. If road traffic reduction targets are being scrapped, if we don't recognise that we live in an environment that is built more for cars than for people at the moment, and there's a huge amount of change about that, we won't achieve what you and colleagues working in this particular topic are trying to achieve unless a great deal else in decision-making locally and nationally changes its priorities. So where are we at in terms of getting the issues in that framework actually understood, embedded, and resulting in different decisions being made in other parts of government, locally and nationally?
That's a big one that I can't answer all of the questions for. But in terms of the national leadership, the two groups that I had mentioned before, it's specifically focused on the framework. Transport Scotland are involved in the national leadership group and in the development group, and then I have been liaising with colleagues in our environment and economy team who lead on planning. So National Planning Framework 4 is really clear and explicit. It's got brilliant policy connects about active travel and places for being physically active. So the policy imperative in NPF 4 is really is phenomenal. It's for us to connect that. So working alongside planning colleagues and those who work on transport through regional transport partnerships to make sure that those people in RTPs or in local authorities that lead on active travel or transport in general are also aware of the framework. So there's the national and local responsibility for the framework as a whole. It is not just Active Scotland Division, it's not just Sport Scotland. There is work that we need to be able to do to make sure that walking really is at the top of the transport hierarchy. I will use this opportunity to talk about the unintended consequences of the free bus travel for under 22s is that what we see is a lot less young people walking, because why would you walk when you've got a free bus pass to take you 2 stops? And I think you would see that far more in urban areas than you would in the rural areas where there's less bus travel and much more reliance on bus travel. So we have to, again, it's that kind of holistic, where does the framework and the investment areas within the framework for travel, how is that embedded within Transport Scotland and their policy and their priorities, and how do we make sure that feeds down at a local level through RTPs and local authorities? And that's part of the work that I'm trying to do in COSLA, and talking. The Physical Activity for Health framework has been to COSLA leaders and all 4 policy boards, so that they have all had a chance to explore and understand their different responsibilities, and I say that in inverted commas and loosely, but their responsibilities for the active travel part of it, the active places and spaces, sits with the environment and economy team, so that we are holistic. I would love for Cabinet to have exactly the same conversation the same that we are now, is that it's not a sports strategy, it's a physical activity for health strategy. We need to get all of the systems within that framework right to make sure that more people walk or cycle. So there is more nationally and locally that absolutely can be done. I can't speak to it all, but I think it is making sure that every organisation with responsibility for parts of the framework understand their responsibilities and buy into it, as I said earlier, the same way Sport Scotland have with their sport and recreation for all, amongst others.
Thank you very much.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Convener, and thanks to members of the panel for their contributions so far. I want to turn to volunteering, and particularly the picture for volunteering since the pandemic. We know that many organisations who are volunteer-led are struggling with what I can only assess has been a doom loop, where reduced volunteer numbers are leading to the remaining volunteers taking on more responsibilities, leading to greater burnout. I mentioned earlier, in terms of facilities, the pressure from local authorities to hand over assets for the management, and then there's a finite pot of funding where organisations are chasing each other, competing for discretionary annual funds. It produces a lot of pressure and a lot of stress. Perhaps that's taken the fun out of volunteering for a lot of organisations and lots of individuals. So I just want to get your impression as a panel of what you think the current volunteer model in Scotland is functioning, how it's functioning, and if not satisfactory, how do you think volunteer organisations and sport and physical activity should be supported further to try and end this, what I can see has been a bit of a doom loop and a cycle of pressure ratcheting up?
I start off with that one, thank you. So, as we all know, volunteers are absolutely vital to sport and the running of sport within the sporting system. If I start with a few positives, we still have lots of volunteers out there day in, day out at weekends, and they are running our sport and our clubs and our competitions for all of our sports and community groups across the country. I think you're really right to highlight that pressure and that burnout, though, and the burden that we're asking of our volunteers. But if we look at Active Schools, we have 19,000 deliverers across that, and 91% of them are volunteering and giving up their time to deliver Active Schools. We've got 13,000 sports clubs in Scotland. That's over 800,000 members of governing bodies, affiliate clubs, and again, they're being upheld by volunteers. I think if we look at then what we're doing, we do work in partnership with a lot of voluntary organisations to help with that training and education of our volunteers, so that they know that their role and they know their job within it. But I think there is that recognition that volunteers are decreasing and that there's a huge ask on them, and that we need to be aware of that to continue to help support them.
Just wondered if you shared that impression about a decline in volunteers and that sense of pressure, despite the good work that's done.
Yes, absolutely. Volunteer numbers are in decline. We've seen those figures. I think about 18% of Scotland's adult population volunteered for an organisation or group in 2023. So that's the first time it's been below 20% in a good number of years. Pre-pandemic, I know that as a sort of high water mark, that was about 26% in 2019. So that's a significant decline in volunteer numbers with organisations. So volunteer numbers are definitely in decline. I should say I do sit as a trustee on the board of Volunteer Scotland, which is the National Centre for Volunteering, so I do see a lot of conversation around this. Volunteers are absolutely under pressure. I do think one of the big opportunities is around employer-supported volunteering. One of the big barriers to getting involved is time. A lot of people are having to work longer hours or pick up additional jobs because of cost of living pressures, and if we want more people, particularly women who might have caring responsibilities, there's more that can be done in terms of supporting them, and I think employer-supported volunteering is a big opportunity where employers give their staff time during the working week to go and volunteer with local organisation, local club, and there's a massive benefit to them as well in terms of mental health and well-being. We know that getting involved in volunteering is good for you and good for the organisations you support. So I'd say that's one of the big opportunities that we could collectively explore in more depth.
Interesting point. Just wonder from a COSLA perspective whether Council's interactions with volunteers and support structures, how that's looked, and we discussed funding pressures for local authorities. Just wonder if you can maybe comment a bit more on that.
Yeah, it's not something I can confidently speak to. It's not, you know, as Ailsa had said, sport in Scotland wouldn't exist without those volunteers, and Leisure Trust and local authorities working closely with their, whether it's through community sport hubs, sports councils, to support that infrastructure that supports volunteering. It's something we, as a group of officers and local authorities, starting to explore local employee volunteer policy, as Gregor had mentioned there, is how do we start working, you know, for example, what's COSLA's volunteer support policy, and how do we filter that down? How do we work with local authorities? It's not a big piece. That's not to say it's not a big piece of work. It's not something I have certainly explored since I started in post. Gregor and Ailsa are far closer to the work of volunteers than me.
Just wondered, you mentioned about volunteer support. Is that something that local authorities themselves are looking to do to support their employees? You know, and obviously in many areas the council is the biggest employer, along with the NHS. So is that something that could make a big impact? There
are some local authorities that have a volunteer policy, and there are some that don't, and that is up to them. What I would like to do in the next year is kind of explore with Volunteer Scotland and their new volunteer charter, is can we take not necessarily a once for Scotland approach, but can we look at the value and the role of volunteering, and that particularly when we come into next year being the Commonwealth Games, and the fact that there will be a push for volunteers, and I'm sure that they open up their applications for volunteers, it would be full within that one day. How do we explore people's want and will to volunteer at these huge national and international events, and how do we take that down and support that locally, where Glasgow 2026 is a smaller Commonwealth Games than 2014. They won't need as many volunteers. So how do we work with Sport Scotland and other organisations to harness that want and will to volunteer at those, you know, very, very shiny, incredible events, to make that something that is supported and sustainable at a local level. And at the most recent National Leadership Group meeting in May, that is one thing that we explored with the organisations that were there. So Sport Scotland, ourselves, Public Health Scotland is looking at the public sector as a huge employer in Scotland, and is there more that we can do to explore supported volunteering? But we're very early in those stages, but it's conversations we've started.
Okay, just to turn to that point that you made, Mr Muir, about the volunteering support opportunity with employers. Obviously, we mentioned I volunteered for the Commonwealth Games in 2014. It was great, and there's a huge atmosphere around it all. And how do you harness that opportunity with a big sporting event to sort of develop those links with employers, maybe test out a model that could work more long term? Is that a legacy opportunity that's been looked at with Sport Scotland and yourselves in the Commonwealth Games organising company?
So aware of the volunteer opportunities that will come with the Games, and like we've done in the past, we'll absolutely be there and round the table for these conversations. I'm not sure around the specifics of looking at that employee support or piloting anything there. But I would like to add just around our young people in Scotland and their appetite to volunteer and be leaders within that sporting sector. We have a huge number, over 24,000 young people within our schools through active schools programmes and through education or in leadership programmes within the sporting environment. And really pleased to report that 12,500 of these are girls and young women in these leadership opportunities, and they deliver a lot back into that sporting sector, and we're definitely seeing a huge rise within active schools delivery coming from our senior pupils and from partnerships with our colleges around work-based placements coming in and serving the purpose both for themselves and their own development. And we're obviously recognising that if the young people are volunteering within sport from a young age, how do we hold on to that and ensure that they continue and have that lifelong involvement with volunteering and with sport.
Okay. Have you any thoughts about how you might put structures in place to sustain that level of interest and engagement through adult years?
I think what we've got there in terms of the systems for sport really lends itself well to that. We've got schools and education where they're getting the chance to be on leadership programmes. Some of them come with a qualification. And then where working with our colleges, we've got an investment in 18 colleges in and around active college campus coordinators who are looking at the participation levels of college students, but also around that work-based placement to ensure that the pupils who were active in secondary school can continue that journey. We work with our partners at SSS around universities and the same, so that we're trying to embed volunteering within our young people through that system.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, and listening very intently to what you've been saying. I want to talk about the role of sport. I know, Gillian, you've alluded to or started that conversation around the impact that physical activity can have in community and culture, the culture of being involved in that. And I was really interested in your 77 million. I've heard that figure before. I think it's a massive underestimation. You know, when we think of things like the impact that physical activity has on mental health, which has exploded. It has on, I mean, obesity is costing the Scottish economy over 5 billion. We've got MSK and heart disease and economic inactivity. So I think 77. I'm really interested with that. I've always tried to work out where that 77 million comes from, because I think it's a massive underestimation. I think also you also talked about cross portfolio, and you talked about. I mean, I think that you know, we know being physically active is going to have a positive impact on health outcomes, which is obviously going to have a positive impact on decreasing the pressure on our health service, but it also impacts education, and it also impacts welfare, and it also impacts justice, and all those different things. So I think with that background, can I ask, you know, do we think there's a policy vacuum at the moment in terms of the importance? We've talked about it, and you've agreed there's an importance in physical activity. I think there's a policy vacuum here in relation to sport in Scotland, and how, and perhaps with development from a more focused policy development in this area. I'll come to you first, Jenny.
Yeah, I don't know if I would describe it as a policy vacuum, because I think the framework really has taken sport and physical activity out of just sport and physical activity and talked about that whole system approach. I think we can do more, and I think conversations like this, between cross-party conversations and within government, to be able to elevate and escalate that exact point that you made there about those cross-policy conversations about it, because we talk a lot about the brilliant and positive impacts of sport. We talk about Scotland's role on the world sporting stage. We talk about us as a destination for international and national competition. We are leading the way on lots of those different things, but we don't leave lots of time and space for us to be able to talk about the real impact that sport and physical activity brings to everything else. And I think there are, whether that is really clear policy intentions, whether that's, I'm nervous to say whether that's re-looking at the legislation. I think it's from the 80s around local government with adequate provision for leisure and culture and what adequate means. I think we can be more ambitious, absolutely, and you look to other countries. You look at UK government and their announcement in sport last week, and you look at other countries who invest more in data so that they really understand what investment is needed to know what difference we can make. And I think we've got, there is absolutely more that we can do around commitments, around investment and around data to really make that difference, so that those who don't have a portfolio hold in sport, justice, education, welfare, understand the importance of being active, whether that is through organised sport or walking more or whatever that might be, how that benefits their policy objectives and their legislative objectives. I think we've got a long way to go, but I think the framework and these kind of conversations are sport and physical activity special interest group, the leadership group, the development group. I think we've got the right places to do it. I think we've started it really well. I think we need to be clearer about those numbers that you mentioned about the cost of obesity, the cost of physical inactivity. I think we need to be much more clear and upfront and feed it into early intervention and prevention, and the fact that we really have to invest. Otherwise, we've got a different public health crisis in 10 years' time.
If I come to you, as was mentioned there, Scotland, we are really, really good on the international stage and so many sports, very good at developing performance, high level performance. We've always been like that, but we are in decline in terms of participation and physical literacy and whatnot at grassroots. So I mean, there's obviously investment we've talked about, a commitment to doubling the sports budget, and since ever I've been in here, that's been on the decline. And guess what? We have results of there are outcomes into that. So how do we develop policy to improve the rates of participation, of children and young people? How do we develop? It's not about developing kids for sport. It's developing kids through sport is probably a better expression, I think. So what policy do we need to put in place to tackle that?
I think more of what we're doing, the greater collaboration between the partners that we currently work with. So if we look at that school environment and being joined up around the PE, physical activity and sport agenda, making sure that PE has been delivered high quality through primary and secondary education, working with our partners at Education Scotland on that one, and then how's that translated then into the opportunities that are being provided out with. And I think our commitment is certainly around delivering our corporate plan, Sport for Life, and continuing to support that sporting system so that there is that system in place for children and young people to develop the skills and then be able to continually participate, whether that's within the school day or extracurricular or into that club and community space.
I think just on that point, finally on that point, I've come back to this before, and the most dangerous phrases I think we can use are "in my day." But in my day, we can actually map out the decline of sport from the late 70s through this teacher strike in the 80s, and all through all of that. And the reality is, I remember, in my day, in Ayrshire there was 36 teams playing rugby. Now there's 6. So there is a specific decline. And we can't go back to where it was, where it was all teachers that ran all, did that through their own, their own time and all that kind of stuff. It's very difficult to go back to that. So we need to find another vehicle that gives kids the opportunity to be physically active and to participate in sport if that's what they want to do. How do we do that?
Again, I think I would go back to what's in place just now and what we are doing with the investment that's there around ensuring that all parts of that system are working and that schools have got the environment and support that they're able to play their part within that school sport, and then Sport Scotland and partners on the ground, local authorities, that we're able to come in and then support that after the school day and then into that club and community environment. And I think we can all appreciate what's been discussed today around some of the decline within participation, within volunteering, within investment. And I think at the moment we're doing the best with what we've got, but we can always do more.
Just like I say to you, Gregor, how do we connect in the national governing bodies into that framework?
I think a lot of them are bought into a lot of the principles of that framework. A lot of the challenges around trying to balance meeting those additional objectives with your day-to-day operational pressures. So all of those things that we've talked about around funding and around volunteer management and making sure that the club network is there, and that all of the day job bits are also quite hard when you're thinking, okay, how are we linking into a national objective around long-term reduction in the burden of non-communicable disease? That's not really the sort of day-to-day operational bit. But I think from a leadership level, that's about providing capacity for them to engage and support and how they can do that, and making some of those links. So with wider partners and with other sectors. So with any given sport, there will be local partnerships that they can put in place between clubs, between transport operators, between schools, that we as sort of intermediary bodies or as other organisations, we can help facilitate some of that stuff that governing bodies don't have the direct resource to do. A lot of this, I think, comes back to resource and capacity to really engage fully. And from our perspective, that's about how can we support some of that work as an intermediary body to help make those connections.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Just waiting to be unmuted. So I have I've been listening intently at the very beginning, and I'm really quite confused as to whether we have good data or we don't have good data, because both things were said at the start. So which is it?
I'm happy to come in on that. That's my favourite subject at the moment. I think we do have good data and we don't have good data. So what we have is Sport Scotland collecting huge amounts of data, as you've heard from Ailsa, whether on their active schools programmes, community sport hubs, governing bodies, and Sport Scotland hold all of that data, and they'll report whether that is back to government or publicly on the data that they gather and collect. So they have good data. We've got the Health and the Household Survey, which is collected every 1 or 2 years, which is the only other way that we can represent physical activity and sport at a national level. I think that is where we have absolute room for improvement at a national level, so that we are able to do the things that your colleagues have talked about today, about understanding and removing those barriers, and then being intentional and targeted alongside the universal support. At that local government level, we absolutely have to do better at the national picture through the LGBF, and I mentioned that earlier with that work through the Local Government Benchmarking Programme Board and local authorities to improve what the LGBF says. But even those in their constituent parts don't give us better data. The opportunity that we have right now is, do we follow similar? Do we follow other countries and the routes they have taken? Sport England and Sport Ireland are two comparable countries that have mentioned, and they invest in the ability to gather very specific data and information at almost population level about participation, about barriers, about inequalities, and then make policy and resourcing decisions based on that data. But we do have, this maybe sound like I'm going to contradict myself, we do have a lot of data that we can put in a better place. So, for example, the Scottish Libraries Information Council have an incredible data platform where they layer multiple levels of data sets to understand who is going to a library, who has a library membership, who doesn't, what age they are, what background they're from, and they understand the profile of library users. Now, local authorities and leisure trusts will have that data because of their management information systems, but we have no way to aggregate that to a national level at the moment. So 32 authorities, 25 leisure trusts will all have their own data that they gather and they use for local information, intelligence, resourcing, policy. At a national level, we don't have a platform like Slick to be able to see that at a national picture, to be able to aggregate lots of different data sets together to understand the national picture and then to make better national policy and investment decisions. I think we're really on the journey, though. I think there's an overall national recognition of those organisations with responsible for that data that we need to do better, and we are really trying to have joined up collaborative conversations about how we do better with the data we have and how do we explore what data we don't have and what we need. But investing in data is a very unpopular thing, I would imagine, when there are multiple things that need investment, and it's the collaborative conversation we need of, do we need to invest in the data to do all of the things that committee members have mentioned today?
Well, I mean, yes, and wouldn't it be great if there was interoperability in some form of stable IT way of getting all this information?
Yeah.
That would be wonderful, wouldn't it? So you spoke about local government needing to do better, but an example, again, at the start that was given was how Dumfries and Galloway have used 12 years of data and put mitigation into place.
Yeah.
So how much better is Dumfries and Galloway doing for participation in sports?
Oh, I couldn't tell you that. we could tell you that on an active schools level, but not every authority takes the approach that Dumfries and Galloway do with their pupil survey around participation in physical activity and sport. That's a Dumfries and Galloway decision since 2013. Ailsa would have the data and information, possibly not right in front of her right now, to tell you about the difference with active schools participation in figures from Dumfries and Galloway to others. But it's an example how Dumfries and Galloway's example, and there will be others, it just so happens that Dumfries is right in front of me right now on my paper, of them investing in surveys and tools. And Dumfries and Galloway Council and their Health and Social Care Partnership work so closely. And they are very invested in using data to make decisions and to understand population. I can't say that 31 other authorities do or don't take that approach. I can certainly find out a little bit more information about how local data and intelligence is gathered and used. I do know that Dumfries are very, very committed to doing that local level survey. I don't know about other authorities off the top of my head.
It's just... And I don't want to pick on you, but it just seems, from my point of view, that we are asking people for some information. It's possible, like in the case of Dumfries and Galloway, that something might be done using that data. But what's the outcome measurements and the decision whether the mitigations that were put into place, the changes, which is what essentially we're talking about, have actually worked? And have you spent money in the right place to make it better, or have you missed that mark and then need to change it? I'm just not hearing that. There's no point in getting data for data's sake. Yeah. What I want to hear is you've got data and you've done something and then you've found out if that's worked or not and then you've gone back. But that doesn't seem to be happening.
It's a difficult one to say it's not helping at a national level. I can certainly submit all of the information from Dumfries. That is exactly, and I feel like I'm picking on Dumfries and Galloway. They sent me over their physical activity report yesterday because I do know that's exactly the way Dumfries and Galloway are working with the survey that they do, is the what investment are they putting in and what's the impact, what are the different levels in for participation, what are the interventions that they need to put into place. We've had this, we were just having this conversation in COSLA yesterday about if the investment that we put in, and a number of local authority officers have mentioned it, local or national investment that we put in, are we achieving the outcomes that we set out with the money that we put in at the beginning? And we probably don't look that way at finance altogether across the public sector. Does the money we put in achieve the outcomes that we intended it to do in the beginning? And that's probably not a discussion for me today or my responsibility. But what we absolutely need to look at, especially in the case of physical activity and sport, as we're all talking about, is the money that we invest locally and nationally making a difference? And if it's not, what do we need to do different?
I mean, that is the nub and the hub of data, yeah, and the point of it. And I think people out there would be shocked to hear that we don't seem to use outcome-driven, focused interventions, not just in this sport area, but across local and national government. That is absolutely vital that we do that. But I do want to ask in a slightly broader sense about data then. So what's the gold standard? And I'm not talking about England and Wales, I'm talking about across the world. What's the gold standard that we should be aiming to achieve when it comes to data? And what do you think that will cost?
I'll go with your second question first. I have no idea what that would cost. I'm not a data expert, and I rely on colleagues in government, in the Improvement Service, in the Digital Office for Scottish Local Government to support the data conversations, because I am absolutely not an expert in it. In terms of the gold standard, I can only talk to the experience I've had with the countries that I've worked with so far. But the gold standard is we have enough data to be able to achieve the outcome of more people more active more often, and that all of that data is held in one place. So what do we need to know to be able to make the decisions that we need to make for a more active population? And how do we understand, using data, what we've put in and what we've got out at the other end of it? And I think in that sort of question of do we have the data or do we not, we absolutely do have the data. 32 local authorities will tell you they are spilling out their ears with data. There's the local government data platform that COSLA, Solace Improvement Service and Scottish Government are working on. I think there are 1 million data points that local government reports outwards. What we don't have is a national repository for the relevant data in sport and physical activity for us, anybody, for publicly available access to go in and see where we are right now and how do we intersect all of that. That doesn't exist at the moment. That would be my gold standard.
So we have all the data that we need to achieve better participation in sport, but we don't have a national repository. Is that paraphrasing what you've just said there?
To a certain extent, because I can't tell you that we have all the data we need without having all of the data that we have in one place, if that makes sense. So I can't tell you exactly all of the data that all 32 local authorities collect around physical activity, leisure and sport to make their decisions, because they don't have to report that anywhere outwardly at the moment. They use that all internally, whether that's to look at outcome measures or to look at participation levels, whether it's membership figures, whatever that might be. The only imperative they have is to collect that locally and make local decisions based on it. So I can't tell you if we have all of that information exactly the same across 32 authorities, other than the active schools level data and the local government benchmarking framework and the health and household survey data. And that is that data improvement work that I explained earlier that we're exploring in partnership with Community Leisure UK and Sport Scotland.
Okay, so we need to ask the Scottish Government to create a national repository for the data that is collected by councils. Anyone else?
Sport Scotland, Community Leisure UK, the census, health data. There is a lot of data that can be added into one place to make better decisions. It's not all about physical activity data. There are lots of proxy level data that we can use to help us make better decisions. And yes, please.
If we were to do that, that would make a huge difference to our understanding of barriers and how to change that.
I think it would help us make less assumption-based decisions and make data and evidence-based decisions.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'm going to bring Brian with one for a very, very brief question and a very brief answer, because we've already run quite a bit over time.
Of course, Convener. Just around the data, my concern around the household data is that when we read the household data, it basically tells us the number of people who are active. What it doesn't do is break that down into SIMD area. My concern is that, and having seen it over the last decades of being involved, is that we're moving participation further and further up the SIMD groups. Sport's almost becoming middle class, and the opportunity across the whole of the country is reducing, and the data doesn't tell us that. Is that something that you recognise?
Yes.
There you go. How quick is that?
Well, certainly the panel heard what I said. Can I thank you all for your evidence this morning to committee. This is our final meeting before summer recess. The committee's next meeting will take place on Tuesday the 2nd of September, and further details of that meeting will be published towards the end of August, and that concludes the public part of our meeting today.